Berlin, April 1944. The lights inside the Air Ministry flickered as another distant American bombing raid sent vibrations through the floorboards. Dust drifted down from the ceiling like the last grains in an hourglass. In a long corridor lit by weak yellow bulbs, German officers stood around a table staring at a single report, one so unbelievable that even the man who wrote it looked afraid to speak. This wasn't a casualty list, nor an intelligence estimate. It was something far more alarming, a projection of how many tanks, ships, and aircraft the United States was expected to build in the next 12 months. And the numbers didn't look real. They looked impossible. General Jeschenek's voice trembled slightly as he read the first line aloud. 50,000 aircraft, in a year? He looked around as if waiting for someone to correct him. Nobody did. Outside, the faint hum of engines echoed, a reminder that American planes, thousands of miles from home, were already overhead. The officers gathered closer, trying to understand how an enemy that had barely been noticed 5 years earlier was now producing more war material than all of Germany's allies combined. At that exact moment, the bunker's air shook again as another formation passed. The men paused, waiting to hear whether the city had been hit. Silence followed only for now. But the officers weren't afraid of bombs. They were afraid of what the bombs represented, an enemy fighting a kind of war no European general had ever studied. A war fought not through battlefield brilliance, but through scale, terrifying, unstoppable scale. They had grown up studying Frederick the Great, Moltke, Clausewitz. None of those men had ever written about how to fight an enemy that could replace a tank faster than Germany could weld one. For a brief moment, one of the officers whispered something he probably didn't expect anyone to hear. "We misjudged them, completely." And though no one responded, everyone understood the truth behind it. Germany had built its strategy on assumptions. The Americans shattered every one of them. But you and I haven't even reached the real turning point yet, not even close. Because this moment, inside a trembling Berlin building, was only the faintest ripple of the realization that was coming. The true shock would arrive in the form of a single question, one that German officers dared not ask aloud. What if America was not fighting the same war at all? What if Germany was playing chess, but America was bulldozing the entire board? Before we get there, let me take you to a different room, a few floors below. A dimly lit communications chamber where a young Wehrmacht intelligence officer was listening to intercepted American radio chatter. He removed his headphones slowly, almost reverently, and showed his superior a translated transcript. The older man frowned as he read it. A convoy of 200 trucks resupplied the division. Another convoy arrives tomorrow. He scowled. This cannot be right. No army resupplies itself that quickly. But it was right. And more convoys were coming. Dozens of them. Hundreds by month's end. The young officer hesitated, then finally said the words that had been tightening in his throat for weeks. "Herr Oberst, we cannot destroy an army that never runs out of anything." The colonel stared at him, stunned by the simplicity of the statement. For years, German strategies had relied on starving the enemy, cutting supply lines, capturing depots, forcing retreats. But the Americans didn't retreat. They didn't starve. They simply kept coming, as if the war was happening in reverse. Instead of becoming weaker with time, they grew stronger. German troops would destroy a regiment, only to face 2 more the next morning. They would shoot down a wave of bombers, only to see an even larger one the next week. And if you're watching this right now, pause for a moment. Imagine being a German soldier on the Western Front, or a general in Berlin, seeing an enemy whose strength didn't diminish but multiplied. If that feels surreal now, imagine how it felt in real time. But the real fear didn't come from American firepower. It came from something far more unsettling. The Americans didn't fight emotionally. They fought methodically, systematically, as though war was just an extension of industry. Germany saw war as an art, maneuver, timing, courage. America saw war as logistics, fuel, trucks, factories, rails. And that difference, that clash in worldviews, would ultimately break Germany's ability to understand what was happening to them. Now, before we move deeper, let me ask you something. Yes, you are watching this right now. If you're still here, it means you're drawn in by the tension, by the unraveling, by the moment a nation built on discipline and precision realized it was being crushed by something it didn't comprehend. So take a second, tap like, subscribe to keep these stories alive, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? Your city, your country, your time of day. It helps this documentary reach more people who love history as much as you do. Because what comes next is where the stakes truly escalate. Back upstairs, the officers continued reading. A new section of the report outlined American shipbuilding numbers. 5 escort carriers every month, one whispered. Destroyers in weeks, not months. Another trembled as he read, Liberty ships, 1 every 3 days. A third pointed to a paragraph describing American fuel production. Germany's entire synthetic fuel program, built at unimaginable cost, was equal to what one American refinery produced casually. And then, perhaps the single most chilling line in the entire document, one officer said quietly, they fight a war without sacrifice. It wasn't true, of course. American soldiers died. Thousands. Tens of thousands. But what he meant was chillingly simple. America fought without rationing its machines, its supplies, its replacements. For every tank Germany lost, the replacement was a struggle, a sacrifice. For America, it was an industrial reflex. Germany fought with limits. America fought without them. And somewhere, deep inside the bunker, the realization began forming like a crack spreading across glass. Germany wasn't fighting another nation. It was fighting a continent-sized factory with a population larger than the entire Reich. A machine that no strategy, no maneuver, no act of genius could stop. And yet, the truth was even worse. Because Germany hadn't even realized the full extent of America's power. Not yet. That moment was still coming. Night settled over Berlin like a suffocating blanket, thick with smoke and tension. The sirens had stopped for the moment, but everyone knew they would start again soon. It was only a matter of when the next bomber stream broke through the clouds. Inside the Air Ministry, the officers remained gathered around those unbelievable American production charts, pages illuminated by the quivering yellow bulbs overhead. No one spoke anymore. Words had become too small, too fragile to carry the weight of what they were reading. Then, almost reluctantly, a colonel broke the silence. This is no longer a war of maneuvers, he whispered. This is annihilation through abundance. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. But the realization of America's terrifying new style of warfare wasn't happening only inside these walls, it was unfolding across an entire continent. Hundreds of miles away, in the forests of France, German field reports painted the same picture, one dispatch after another describing something that didn't fit any model of European warfare. A commander wrote, "We destroyed an American column today." By the evening, another, twice as long, replaced it. Another report, "Their artillery has so much ammunition they fire barrages without targets, just to keep us awake." And another, "We counted more trucks in a single U.S. convoy than our entire division now possesses." This wasn't just overwhelming. It was psychologically corrosive. Soldiers who had once believed they were fighting for the destiny of Europe suddenly felt as though they were drowning under a tide they could never push back. German generals had always valued the idea of Schwerpunkt, the decisive point, the brilliant blow that collapses the enemy's lines. But how do you break an enemy whose lines regenerate faster than you can strike them? How do you outmaneuver a foe whose strength grows every hour? These questions began to haunt the staff rooms, echoing like distant artillery bursts. One evening, in a dim field HQ on the Western Front, a veteran officer ran his hand across a captured American helmet. "They fight like engineers," he muttered. "Everything is measured, calculated, replaceable." His younger adjutant frowned. "Isn't that efficient?" The older man shook his head, eyes hollow. "No, it is horrifying. Because we know how to fight soldiers. But we don't know how to fight a system." That distinction between army and system became the quiet, devastating realization spreading through the Wehrmacht like a slow poison. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, a new document surfaced on the conference table. It was a logistics breakdown intercepted from the U.S. Army. The officers leaned closer, scanning the lines in disbelief. Every American infantry division, one read, possesses more motor transport than an entire German corps. Another pointed, fuel reserves exceeding what the Wehrmacht consumes in a month. A third officer's voice grew faint as he read, each division travels with its own mobile repair shops, spare engines, replacement barrels, medical units capable of treating 1,000 casualties a day. They looked at one another in stunned silence. Germany's war machine, once believed to be the most modern and formidable in Europe, now looked medieval by comparison. The Americans fought like a moving city, self-sustaining, self-repairing, self-feeding. They didn't pause. They didn't slow. They didn't wait for supply, because the supply moved with them. In the old European way of war, battles halted when armies ran short of ammunition or food. But the Americans never ran short. They brought their entire economy to the front. One officer finally blurted out what everyone had been trying not to think. It is as if every American soldier has 1,000 workers behind him. Another corrected him softly. Not 1,000. 10,000. A quiet shudder passed around the room. They all sensed the same terrible truth. This wasn't a war Germany could win by courage or discipline. The enemy was too large, too fast, too endlessly supplied. Across the Atlantic, America had turned its automobile factories into tank lines, its shipyards into steel forests, its aircraft plants into roaring mechanical hives. And Germany, trapped under blockade, strangled by fuel shortages, was still trying to build the same tanks by hand, with craftsmen under bombing raids. The difference wasn't simply industrial. It was philosophical. Germany still believed war was fought by warriors. America believed war was fought by production schedules. But the most chilling realization was yet to come. Late that night, a messenger rushed into the Air Ministry and handed a coded telegram to General Jeschneck. His eyes scanned it quickly, then stopped. His jaw tightened. He read the line again, as if repetition might change the meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. They lost 3,000 planes last year and replaced them. The officers stared blankly. 3,000 planes was more than the Luftwaffe could dream of building. One general muttered, "We lose 300 and it cripples us." Another added, "They lose thousands, and it doesn't matter." That word, "doesn't matter," hit the room like a blunt instrument. But the next sentence in the report was the one that truly broke them. U.S. training programs already have enough new pilots to fill every lost cockpit twice over. For the first time, one of the officers stepped back from the table as if the document itself were dangerous. "This is not normal," he whispered. "This is not human." Germany had always believed in qualitative superiority, better tanks, better tactics, better soldiers. But America wasn't playing that game. America didn't need the best tank. It needed the most tanks. America didn't need the perfect strategy. It needed relentless pressure. And America didn't need to win spectacular battles. It simply needed to grind until the opponent collapsed. In the dim bunker light, the officers slowly understood that they were not fighting the United States Army. They were fighting the American way of life, its industry, its fuel, its vast geography, its millions of workers, its unstoppable momentum. And yet, even that wasn't the full truth. A more terrifying realization was coming, one that Germany had never imagined possible. The turning point, though no one recognized it at first, arrived not from the skies above Berlin or the forests of France, but from a tiny German town that was collapsing under the weight of retreating troops. A Wehrmacht logistics officer, exhausted and coated in dust, stood near the crossroads watching an American convoy approach from miles away. He lifted his field binoculars. His hands shook, not from fear, but from disbelief. The convoy didn't end. It stretched beyond the horizon, snaking toward him like a steel river breaking every expectation he had ever learned in war school. Trucks, fuel tankers, bulldozers, jeeps, ambulances, artillery tractors, mobile workshops, kitchens, radio trucks, an entire ecosystem on wheels. It moved with a rhythm, a smoothness that looked almost unnatural to his eyes. He whispered to the soldier beside him, "This is not an army. This is a world. The young soldier didn't respond. He was too busy staring open-mouthed at the endless line of vehicles rumbling forward with unstoppable confidence. When American armored divisions advanced, the officer later wrote in his diary, it looked as though a second division marched behind them, made entirely of supply. And a third behind that. And a fourth. Days later, fragments of these field reports reached Berlin, landing on the same trembling table where the production charts lay. One general slammed the page down and rubbed his forehead. We always believed mobility was our weapon, he said bitterly. But these Americans, they move faster than we can think. Another officer added, we planned every operation down to the last liter of fuel. They swim in it. Yet another said with a hollow laugh, we designed Blitzkrieg. And they perform it better than we ever did. Each new report confirmed the same disturbing truth. America didn't fight along the lines of exhaustion. They fought along the lines of abundance. Their tanks didn't break down and halt the offensive, they were repaired within hours. Their infantry didn't starve and retreat, they were fed, clothed, transported, and supplied by a logistical machine so vast it felt like a second enemy moving invisibly behind the front line. German soldiers began describing the impossible phenomenon in letters home. The Americans attacked in the morning, attack again in the afternoon, and attack at night. Their energy is not human. One winter night, in a muddy command tent outside Aachen, a young German captain frantically plotted a counterattack. His division had fought all day and repelled 2 American breakthroughs, but the third one, the one they expected to be weak, was even stronger. How? He whispered. How do they do this? A wounded sergeant, propped against a crate, coughed painfully. Because we're fighting men, he said, and they're fighting with factories. The captain didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was swallowing the front entirely. News of these field observations made their way back to Berlin, where Hitler himself studied them with tightening lips. It cannot be, he muttered. They are soft, decadent, unfocused. But the evidence crushed his denial. America wasn't soft. It wasn't weak. And it wasn't slow. It was something Germany had never faced before. A fully mechanized democracy that could produce more machines than Hitler could destroy and more soldiers than Hitler could hope to intimidate. Still, the most devastating realization was not about the quantity of American resources. It was about how America used those resources. In the dark conference room, a Luftwaffe strategist pointed at a series of intercepted logistical maps. They don't fight for cities, he said. They fight for supply lines. Roads. Ports. Airstrips. A general frowned. Why does that matter? The strategist looked around at the men who had spent decades studying European war theory. Because we were trained to defend geography. They attack mathematics. That sentence froze the room. For the first time, Germany understood that America's war was not emotional. It wasn't ideological. It wasn't fueled by revenge or glory or conquest. It was clinical, mechanical, predictable only in its relentlessness. America didn't try to outthink Germany. It tried to overwhelm it with numbers so large that strategy itself became irrelevant. In one intercepted transmission, an American officer told his men, if you can't win, call for more artillery. A German general read that line 3 times. More artillery, he muttered. Always more. As if they have no limit. And maybe that was the most terrifying realization. America fought a war without limits. In the weeks that followed, German units retreating across the Western Front began sending in reports that felt like confessions. One captain wrote, their soldiers fight with confidence because they know behind them stands a nation that will never run out. Another wrote, we are fighting an enemy whose strength increases as ours declines. It is like fighting a rising tide. Back in Berlin, ministers tried to reassure one another that German willpower, German ingenuity, and German tactical brilliance would eventually balance the scales. But then came the moment that ended such hopes entirely. A courier entered the war room holding a single sheet of paper, an American manufacturing update. As Hitler read it, his jaw tightened. The United States was producing more tanks per month than Germany produced in a year. More aircraft in one season than the Luftwaffe could field in its entire force. More trucks, jeeps, and support vehicles than Germany had fuel to operate. "We are not fighting an army," Hitler whispered. "We are fighting a continent." Even Joseph Goebbels, master of propaganda, admitted privately in his diary, "America fights a different kind of war. One we cannot match. One we cannot even understand." But the deepest crack in German morale came from a revelation that no one had expected, one that made all the others look small. Because Germany finally learned why America fought differently. And that truth, coming from a captured American officer, shook the German high command more than any bombing raid ever could. The revelation arrived quietly, far too quietly for what it would mean. It came not through intelligence intercepts or intercepted logistics maps, but from a captured American officer sitting in a dim interrogation room on the outskirts of Cologne. He wasn't defiant or broken, just tired. Mud still clung to his boots. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. A German intelligence colonel sat across from him, flipping through the officer's papers, searching for weakness, error, anything that might explain the unstoppable rhythm of the U.S. advance. But nothing fit the old German models of warfare. So finally, the colonel leaned forward and asked the question that had been burning beneath every report sent to Berlin for months: "How is it that your army never stops?" The American officer blinked. For a moment, he didn't understand the question. Then, slowly, a faint smile touched his lips, not arrogance, not triumph, but something closer to pity. "We don't stop," he said, "because our country doesn't stop." The colonel frowned. "Factories?" he asked. "Industry?" The American shook his head. "People," he said. "Ordinary people." The colonel stared at him, confused. "Explain." The American looked down at his hands as if searching for the right place to begin. "Back home, every man, woman, and child is part of this war. Not because they fear punishment, not because they worship a leader, but because they expect each other to do their part." He paused. "You're fighting a military. We're fighting with society." That sentence was written into the interrogation report, underlined twice by the German intelligence officer, and rushed to Berlin the next morning. When the report reached the war room, a silence spread through the high command like cold air. The phrase didn't sound dramatic. It didn't even sound threatening. But it changed everything. Because it explained what Germany had been unable to understand from the first day American troops landed in Europe. America didn't fight alone. Behind every soldier stood millions of civilians who believed in the war, not out of fear, but out of duty. Germany's factories were bombed into rubble, their fuel plants collapsing, their rail lines torn apart by British and American air power. But America? Every time a B-17 fell from the sky, 5 more rolled off an assembly line. Every time a Sherman tank burned on a French road, 2 more were already being shipped. Every time a U.S. infantry regiment suffered casualties, a replacement regiment was already training, already equipped, already fed, already supplied, already on its way. That kind of war didn't come from generals. It came from a nation. But the officers in Berlin didn't want to believe it. Their pride rebelled against the idea. So they sent the report to a social analyst inside the Reich security main office, one of their brightest minds. His conclusion was blunt. The Americans do not fight for survival. They fight for purpose. And purpose cannot be blockaded. When Hitler read that line, he crumpled the page in his fist. "Nonsense," he hissed. "They are soft. Capitalists. Weak." But Goebbels, standing nearby, recognized the danger immediately. Soft armies do not advance across France in 6 weeks. Soft armies do not replace entire divisions without hesitation. Soft armies do not cross oceans to liberate continents. By now, the psychological collapse inside the German high command was impossible to hide. Even the most loyal officers were beginning to whisper doubts. Some blamed Hitler. Others blamed God. One general, in a private conversation, said, "We believed the Americans were amateurs. But they have become professionals. And we have become exhausted shadows." Meanwhile, in the field, German commanders faced a terrifying new reality. Americans fought with energy. Endless, terrifying energy. Their soldiers marched long hours without breaking. Their armored columns traveled farther in a week than German divisions could travel in a month. Their aircraft patrolled the skies day and night, almost indifferent to weather. Their logistics officers could reroute an entire supply network overnight. This wasn't normal warfare. It was something else, something mechanical, something relentless, something that looked from the German perspective almost inhuman. A captured Wehrmacht lieutenant, interviewed by Allied historians after the war, put it simply, the Americans fought like a machine. And we were flesh and blood. That was Germany's growing fear in 1944 and 1945, not just defeat, but irrelevance. Their traditional strategies, encirclement, Schwerpunkt, lightning war, collapsed against an enemy who refused to play the same game. But the final blow to German morale came not from American tanks or planes or factories. It came from a small detail in a single intercepted message. A divisional commander on the U.S. side had requested reinforcements and received this reply. Approved. Additional battalion arriving in 48 hours. Fuel unlimited. Unlimited. The German officer who translated the message underlined the word 3 times. Unlimited. Germany had never known that word, not in 1939, not in 1940, and certainly not in 1944. Everything in the German war effort had limits: fuel, metal, rubber, men, trucks, even time itself. But the Americans, at least from the German point of view, seemed to operate in a different universe. Unlimited fuel. Unlimited trucks. Unlimited replacements. Unlimited will. And now Germany understands why. The Americans weren't fighting for territory. They were fighting for the idea that their system, democratic, industrial, self-confident, could outlast anything built on tyranny. And it was working. The officers in Berlin, once masters of Europe, now looked at one another with the same hollow expression. They realized they weren't watching a military defeat. They were watching the collapse of an entire worldview. But the true reckoning was still ahead. Because Germany had seen America's numbers. Germany had studied America's logistics. Germany had witnessed America's speed, fuel, and mobility. But Germany had not yet faced America's final advantage. The advantage that would make even the industrial numbers look small. The advantage that would make some officers whisper, "Then we never had a chance at all." The final shock did not come with the roar of engines or the distant thud of bombs. It arrived in silence, creeping into the German high command like a cold draft through a cracked window. It began with a series of field interviews, conducted by Wehrmacht intelligence officers who had finally been forced to confront a question they had avoided for years. What motivates the American soldier? Up until this point, Germany had always believed something reassuring, something simple. They assumed American soldiers were fighting for money, or adventure, or naive patriotism. But when the interviews came back, translated and neatly typed, everyone in the bunker felt a subtle but unmistakable shiver as they read the answers. A recurring pattern ran through the testimonies, something Germany had never accounted for, something that made every tank factory and fuel depot seem secondary. American soldiers genuinely believed they were fighting for freedom, their own and others. Not in the abstract, not in propaganda, not in slogans shouted at rallies. They believed it deeply. A captured American sergeant told his interrogator, "I'm here because I want my kids to live in a world without people like Hitler." Another said, "We don't conquer. We fix things." One young tanker, barely 20, said, "We don't want territory. We just want to end this madness." When Hitler heard those lines, he laughed, the brittle, humorless laugh of a man who can no longer tell the difference between belief and threat. "Fools," he muttered. "Deluded fools." But others in the room didn't laugh. They recognized something Hitler couldn't. America's war effort wasn't driven by fear, it was driven by conviction. A nation fighting out of fear can be broken. A nation fighting out of duty can be exhausted. But a nation fighting because it believes it is doing the right thing is almost impossible to defeat. A senior officer finally said what many were thinking: Mein Führer, their strength is not only in factories. It is on purpose. Hitler snapped back instantly. Purpose means nothing without tanks. But even as he shouted it, his voice cracked. Because deep down, beneath the rage, beneath the denial, he knew the truth. Tanks can be destroyed. Bridges can be bombed. Men can be killed. But an idea, once rooted in millions of hearts, can be terrifyingly resilient. In the weeks that followed, as American forces crossed the Rhine and raced deep into Germany, this realization spread like a whisper along the collapsing front. The Americans weren't simply overpowering Germany. They were outlasting it. The German soldier fought until the fuel ran out, until the bullets were gone, until the knees buckled under exhaustion. But the American soldier fought knowing the entire nation stood behind him, its economy, its families, its factories, its farms, its workers, its schools, its dreams. Every victory Germany achieved in the early years of the war was built on the illusion that Europe was the center of the world. But now, watching American armored columns drive across the heart of the Reich, German officers finally understood that the center of the world had shifted, and they had never noticed. One evening in late March 1945, a German general stood outside his command post as American half-tracks rolled through the shattered remains of a German town. He watched silently, the wind whipping at his greatcoat, the ashes of bombed buildings swirling at his feet. Beside him, a young lieutenant murmured, "They fight without hatred." The general nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is their greatest weapon." Then, after a long pause, he added, "and the one we never understood." Back in Berlin, the final reports from the Western Front arrived in chaotic bundles, scribbled notes, frantic messages, half-burned papers rescued from overrun HQs. But one message stood out. A German colonel had written a final assessment in the margin of a larger document, almost as an afterthought. It read, "They did not fight our war. They fought their own. And that is why we lost." When this line was read aloud in the bunker, no one argued. No one scoffed. No one dismissed it. Because by now, the truth had become impossible to deny. Hitler sat slumped in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as he stared down at the mess of reports scattered across his desk. He whispered, barely audible, "America should never have entered the war." But Goebbels, standing behind him, quietly corrected him. They were always going to win, mein Führer, whether they entered early or late. At that moment, Hitler understood, perhaps more clearly than he ever had, that his greatest strategic mistake had not been Stalingrad, or North Africa, or even the invasion of the Soviet Union. His greatest mistake had been declaring war on a country he didn't understand. A country that fought on principles, not desperation. A country whose strength grew with distance, not shrank. A country that turned oceans from barriers into highways. A country that could replace every loss, repair every setback, rebuild every broken machine. America didn't fight the way Germany expected. America didn't fight the way Europe had always fought. America fought a different kind of war. And the day Germany realized this, truly realized it, was the day many officers quietly admitted the war was already lost. In the last hours of the Reich, as Berlin shook under the thunder of Soviet artillery and American bombers circled overhead, one German officer said to another, "Do you think history will understand how we lost?" The other officer, eyes heavy with exhaustion, replied, "History will understand. We lost the moment we fought a nation we mistook for ordinary." Outside, the city burned. Inside, an entire worldview collapsed. Because Germany had finally understood the truth. They had never been prepared for America. Not the real America. Not the America that fought with factories, with families, with ideals, with distance, with conviction, with limits so far beyond Germany's that the comparison felt almost mythic. And long after the smoke cleared, long after the maps were redrawn, long after the war ended, one sentence remained in the diaries of German officers, a simple summary of the war that had crushed them. It was not their weapons that defeated us. It was their way of fighting.